All right, welcome to our circadian rhythm series. This is Dr. Chell here, and today we're going to be talking about the benefits of sun exposure. So, if you haven't already checked it out, I did an intro video on circadian rhythm, which will give you a bit of background. It's not necessarily a prerequisite for this, but it will be very helpful if you're totally new to the subject. But otherwise, we're talking all things sun today. So, let's dive in. I would say, this is a bold statement, I know, but I would say that sunlight is the most important nutrient our body needs. And hopefully, I'll convince you that this is true by the end of this presentation. I know this is kind of counter to a lot of conventional wisdom that we hear about how the sun is dangerous and it's going to give you skin cancer and sunburns and all this stuff. But I think we're seeing this backwards, and it's actually one of the most important aspects of our health and one of the most important nutrients we need. So, as I said, I'm going to try to convince you. So I'm going to start off with a couple studies here. So honestly, there isn't that much research to support the idea that the sun is super dangerous and is causing all these negative health effects in us. But there's quite a bit of the opposite. So for example, there's a couple studies looking at all-cause mortality, which is basically death from all causes, and they study who gets the most sun exposure, who gets the least, and how does that impact your mortality. So this is one study that showed that so you can see in the results here, the mortality rate amongst avoiders of sun exposure was approximately twofold higher compared with the highest sun exposure group. Okay, and the conclusion is that avoiding sun exposure is a risk factor for all-cause mortality. So in other words, the people who got the least amount of sun exposure were actually twice as likely to die from all causes compared to people with the highest sun exposure. Okay, and there's actually quite a few studies on this. So here's another one. And in the abstract, you can see increasing sun exposure is related to lower prevalence of death and cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and other non-cancer, non-cardiovascular diseases. Data support the hypothesis that low sun exposure habits are a major risk factor for all-cause mortality. Okay, so I think we just need to understand that a lot of these things we've been told or sold are not really true when you look at the research. Of course, you're going to see some things on both sides, but I would argue that the sun provides far more benefit than it does damage, and we need to start shifting our perception of this if we want to enjoy good health. All right, so we'll get the boring stuff out of the way. I just want to give you guys a quick primer on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's a very vast thing, and it's kind of tough to wrap your head around because basically everything in the universe is some sort of electromagnetic energy. But when we're looking at the sun actually emits basically the entire electromagnetic spectrum here, but we mostly focus on ultraviolet, and the visible light spectrum, as well as infrared. Okay, we don't really talk about X-rays, gamma rays so much because not a lot of that actually penetrates down into the atmosphere to affect us. But we're mainly looking at those kind of middle three there. So UV, visible light, and infrared. And in particular, red and infrared have a major role in sun exposure. And you can see that with like the visual color of it, right? It's kind of like a red-orange color because that's the predominant spectrum that's present there. So more specifically, if we look at the changes throughout the day, so when we start with the sunrise, that VIS means visual light. So sunrise, you have visual light, and IR is infrared. Okay, and then once we get into later in the morning, same thing, visual light, infrared, but then we also add some UVA. Okay, so there's different types of UV, UVA, B, and C. C isn't too relevant here, but UVA and B are the predominant ones in sunlight. But UVB doesn't come up until midday. Okay, and that's where you can produce vitamin D. That's where you might get a sunburn because that UVB, once it gets higher in that, or once the sun gets higher in the atmosphere, those UV rays can penetrate more deeply. And again, you need to this is dependent on where you are in the world and seasonality too. So for an example, I live in Canada, and in the middle of winter, we don't get any UVB. Doesn't matter what time of day it is, even if it's solar noon, there's no UVB because the angle of the sun isn't high enough. Whereas if you're at the equator, you're gonna get a lot more UVB throughout the year, but this is just generally. So then after midday, once we get into late afternoon, it's basically the reverse. So we no longer have UVB, but we still have UVA, visual light, infrared energy, and then sunset, we have visual light and infrared as well. Okay. And it's not super important to know that, but I just want you guys to have a general understanding of what is present so that when we go into some different concepts, you'll kind of understand how to apply this properly. Okay. So what are the benefits? So light is the primary Zeitgeber. So if you didn't see my previous presentation on Intro to Circadian Rhythm, Zeitgebers are time givers or external cues that regulate your circadian rhythm. And your circadian rhythm is the mechanism that basically controls your entire physiology. So light is the most important one. So obviously getting as much natural sunlight as you can is going to be a major cue for your body. Another thing, sunlight is going to regulate hormone production and release. So there's plenty of hormones that are either produced or activated or inactivated or released based on your sun exposure, which is pretty cool. It improves energy production, which is also very big. So if you think about just energy in general on the planet, all of that comes from the sunlight. And we think that we have to get it through food, which is one way to get that stored sun energy, but we can actually directly harness some of that energy from the sun to, it's not really producing energy, but it's transforming the energy from the sun for us to utilize in our daily functions. Lastly, it synthesizes plenty of compounds for our body. So we'll get into all these things in a little bit more detail. I'll try to keep it relatively brief as well. So from a circadian rhythm standpoint, we have sunlight, which enters the eyes through light receptors, also called photoreceptors. And that transmits the signal to a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that is where the central clock or the main timing mechanism of our circadian rhythm lies. So in the hypothalamus, in that structure, and then that communicates with the rest of the body. So I always like to think of it as the conductor of the orchestra being your cells and your organs. So that's kind of how sunlight plays into this. And then from there, it's actually not just the light, but also food, activity, and body temperature, and a few other factors that also control this. But light is the most important one. Oh, sorry. Let's go back one. Okay. And then this is kind of just like an oversimplification, but also a very important concept to understand is the cortisol and melatonin relationship. So this is kind of like the yin and yang of our circadian rhythm. So in the morning, if you look at that solid line, we have our cortisol, which spikes in the morning, and that helps to keep us awake, give us energy. Basically, it's what gets you out of bed. And then throughout the day, that starts to decrease. And oppositely, once that decreases, melatonin is going to start increasing. This is our yin hormone that comes out at night, and it's responsible for all our regeneration, all our repair. It's one of the body's primary antioxidants. So you definitely need this at night for your body to heal and recover properly. So as the cortisol is going up, melatonin is decreased. And then, the opposite, as cortisol starts going down, melatonin is going to increase. And this is all, well, I shouldn't say all of it, but is primarily regulated by the light and darkness cycles. So you need to be getting as much sun exposure as you can during the day to help promote cortisol. And it actually produces melatonin, which we'll talk about later, but it doesn't release it. It gets released at night in the presence of darkness. So you don't just need sunlight, you also need darkness, because that's how we've evolved for hundreds of thousands of years as diurnal animals. Basically, all animals have developed this schedule, whether they're diurnal or nocturnal, but that is all regulated by the light and dark cycles, okay? All right, so in terms of some of the compounds that are produced, this is also very important. Most people don't know this. So we have different amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. And there's certain ones called aromatic amino acids that actually absorb light, in particular UVA light, which catalyzes the reaction of them being converted into different molecules. So if you look at the top, we have phenylalanine, which is one of these amino acids. And when that absorbs light, UVA sunlight, it gets converted into tyrosine, which gets converted into T3 and T4, which are your thyroid hormones, obviously very important. And then it also ends up becoming melanin, which is your skin pigment that gives you a tan, basically. Dopamine, one of the primary motivation molecules, and also responsible for a number of other things, including movement. And then your stress hormones, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Okay, so these are all like very foundational hormones and signaling molecules. We also have tryptophan, which you've probably heard of as the amino acid that you get sleepy after a big turkey dinner, which is somewhat true, but it's probably not related to the turkey so much. But they say that because tryptophan gets converted into serotonin, which is your feel-good hormone, and then eventually melatonin, which we just spoke about, which is very important for resting and rejuvenating at night. and also may play a role in psychedelic drugs if you're into that. So you got to make sure that you're getting these dietarily, which isn't too difficult if you're eating, a good amount of protein, but you also need the sunlight to make sure that you're creating these molecules. Okay. And then just at the bottom quickly, histidine also becomes histamine, which is responsible for many parts of immune function and all sorts of other things. So these are all intricately related to our biology, but we need sunlight in order to produce these properly. Okay, so I touched a little bit on photoreceptors. So these are basically molecules that absorb light, which causes some sort of change in biological function. And the more we learn about this, it seems like just about everything in the body is some form of photoreceptor. It absorbs some sort of light and has some sort of biological function, and we're kind of just scratching the surface of this. But some of the ones that we do know, we classically think of the retina. So that's a part of the eye that contains these photoreceptors, in particular rods, cones, which are the for part of the visual pathway. So that's for like actually seeing things, seeing colors, that sort of stuff. But then melanopsin is a non-visual photoreceptor, so it has nothing to do with your vision, but this is a key one in regulating your circadian rhythm. So melanopsin senses blue light, and then that sends a signal to that part of the brain I was talking about and regulates your circadian rhythm. Your skin is also a photoreceptor. So it contains melanin, this pigment which absorbs almost the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and it can help produce energy, for example. Another one is heme. So this is an iron containing molecule that we find primarily in red blood cells, but we also find it in the liver, in the mitochondria, all sorts of places throughout the body. And heme absorbs red light, which we'll get into here. So this is pretty cool because in the mitochondria, we have these different, in particular in the electron transport chain, we have these different proteins called respiratory proteins. And basically what happens is you get electrons from sunlight or food or from the earth if you're standing there barefoot. And these electrons, they jump from protein to protein and end up making energy or ATP. So one of these proteins called cytochrome C oxidase is a heme containing photoreceptor. So it actually absorbs red and infrared light directly, and that can increase energy production totally independent of what you eat. So that's pretty cool because in a way, we now know we're also photosynthesizing kind of like plants in that we can absorb light directly. We don't necessarily need to eat to get the majority of our energy formed. So I think that's very cool. Maybe you guys don't, but I think that's pretty remarkable. Another thing that red and infrared light does, and part of UV as well, it creates this type of water in our body called EZ water or exclusion zone water. So you can check out the work of Gerald Pollack if you want to learn more. He has a good TED talk on this that's pretty understandable for the layman. And what happens is when water in your body, obviously we're composed of quite a bit of water. When water is exposed to infrared energy, it creates this exclusion zone. So what happens is we have various proteins in our body. This infrared energy creates a separation of negative and positive ions. So you can see close to the center here, there's lots of negative ions, and then outside of that, it excludes the positive protons, and it creates this energy gradient. So what happens when you have positive on one side and negative on the other? It creates a battery. And this may actually be one of the main ways that our body produces energy. So we commonly think of ATP, but there's actually other theories that perhaps this is the primary source of energy in our body. So it's pretty cool. But the point is there's all these different things in our body that are absorbing light and having a pretty significant biological effect. And one of the biggest ones is actually water. So some other compounds, vitamin D. So I've talked about all these other things. We haven't even gotten to vitamin D yet. And normally when I ask people, what does the sun do? They're going to say something along the lines of, well, it produces vitamin D. Beyond that, I don't know. And I can just take a vitamin D supplement. So why do I even need the sun, right? But I've already gone over all these other things. We haven't even touched vitamin D yet. So that's how important sunlight is. So vitamin D is obviously very important for the immune system. It also helps with, regulating the balance of different minerals in the body, bone health, that sort of stuff. Nitric oxide is a very important molecule in the body. That's a vasodilator. So it opens up the blood vessels. And this gets produced in response to UVA light. So just being outside can decrease your blood pressure because what's happening is your the red blood cells and the vasculature are absorbing that infrared energy, the UV energy, it dilates the blood vessels, which decreases blood pressure. One other pretty cool compound is pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. So if you break that down, the opio part is a short form for opiate. Your body actually produces endorphins in response to sunlight. So that's kind of that feel good feeling that you get from being in the sun. Right? I don't think anyone says they don't like the sun. Like, it always feels good unless you're getting burnt to a crisp. But other than that, it feels good because we're producing endorphins, and I would argue that we're designed by nature to be addicted to sunlight. Why else would it produce endorphins for us, right? So I don't think it's a bad thing if it's telling us, telling your body to feel good when it's exposed to it. We also have ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that ends up releasing cortisol, and then MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and that produces melanin for the body, which is very important for a tan and also energy production, as I mentioned, as it absorbs all these different frequencies of light and converts that into energy as well. All right, so back to my original statement. I strongly believe that this is the most important nutrient for our body. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. Hopefully, I've convinced you at least of some more importance that you may not have known of before. And I'm going to be doing some more videos on circadian rhythm related things. We're going to talk about artificial light as well, and kind of the balance between natural artificial light. How do we manage that properly? So thank you for watching. And if there's any other topics you'd like to know about, you can comment below. So below this, I'm going to include some links of different resources you can check out, including natural blocks, which are blue blocking glasses, which I developed with my partner. So we just released our nighttime sleep glasses, which we're pretty excited about. So these block the entire blue and part of the green spectrum, which helps to preserve your melatonin, which I spoke about. It's a very important hormone. And if you're exposed to any artificial light at night, it is going to decrease your melatonin. You're not going to get proper sleep quality, and this is going to lead to all sorts of problems in the future. And then we also have our daytime energy glasses, which are excellent for screen use and being under any type of artificial light during the day, which blocks out the primary spike of blue that comes from these screens, but it still allows some through because it's also important to regulate your body's circadian rhythm, as you learned today. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys later.